Sorry about that.
Or I can let him in if you'd like, but I can wait for you to get the screen share up.
Yes, sorry, my record button has disappeared. There we go.
Sorry, I won't make the happy hour afterwards, but have one for me.
Raise a glass for sure, and I did hear you promise that you'll have one later, so you can think of us then. Everybody, it's great to see you all, whether it's your names or your videos. We're going to wait a few minutes to get started, as we usually do, to let people get settled. So we'll probably start at around 4:03 Eastern time. And Aaron, I will pass it to you to thank our sponsors first, right?
Yes, we typically just let these slides go through. All right, Andrew, if you want to get started, you are welcome.
We can go another minute to let folks get settled. Just to reinforce this, prepare the active side of your brain. We will be doing a pre-poll and a post-poll here to see if anything we do, any part of this conversation changes your mind. So.
Okay, what's the significant effect size of that, Andrew?
Thanks, Eric. It is anonymous. Do not double post. You'll see it's an ordinal, not an interval scale, although maybe that's up for debate. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you all for coming today. My name is Andrew Ho. I'm a professor at Harvard, and I am also a member of the NCME Board of Directors. And in that role, I just want to extend my continuing gratitude to our annual meeting program chairs from the 2020 meeting who are continuing in their service to keep this community going. That's Drew, Thanos, and Ada, as well as Ethan and Aaron on our NCME staff. And Aaron has got the Zoom controls today, so thank you to her for that. You're supporting the NCME community through a summer of physical distance, but thanks, I think, to all of their hard work, intellectual and social proximity, if you will, right? I want to just say that I'm thrilled to be with such a stellar group of scholar practitioners today. We're going to turn to Jen, Wayne, Laurie, Laura, Deanna, and EC shortly. Just a note here, EC is in Singapore, where it's 4:04 in the morning. So I'm grateful that all of you are willing to debate whether, and if so, how, to use predictive information to set performance standards. And I want to get to a poll, and then I want to get to Jen for the first presentation. But I want to start by using the privileges of my role as organizer of this session to begin with a moment of silence. And you may use the silence as you wish, but I will use it to consider both the continued violence against Black community members and individuals here in the US, including the police shooting of Jacob Blake in front of his 3 children just this past Sunday. And I will also use it to mourn the loss of 178,000 Americans who have died from COVID-19 this year. I think it's important not to become numb to this injustice and this loss. And so if we can pause the waiting room for a moment, Aaron, and mute where possible, I will begin this moment of silence now. Thank you. So I want to turn back to the matters at hand. It is really an exciting, I think, discussion that we have in front of us. It's a debate I've had in my own head and between me and EC over the past many years, as she was a doctoral student with me at Harvard and is now at the Ministry of Education in Singapore. A lot of this stems from a paper by Katie McClarty and her co-authors, including Jen, and it goes back many years. It goes back many, many years to the beginnings of standard setting itself. And so it's this eternal debate. And so I'm sure we're going to solve it today. But I want to start by being a little bit empirical. And I'm going to put in the chat here, and I hope you'll all participate. I'm going to put in the chat a Google form. And this Google form sort of asks for your initial opinions about predictive standard setting. And if you don't really know what predictive standard setting is, that's okay. You can sort of choose the middle entry if you like. But if you could please go to this Google form, and I'll put it in for the 3 people who just joined. Now we can sort of get your initial opinions, and then we're going to have a debate, and we'll see if people's minds have changed. So if you could go to that link now, we'll register those data before we get started with our discussion. You can see we've already got 30 responses, which is very quick. And again, I'll put it in the chat. For those of you on your phones, I think you can still click on it. So. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen here. And again, I'll put it in the chat one more time. I'm going to share my screen, just show you the results of this poll. We've got about 2/3 of respondents here. And we have a lot of people who are on the fence. So out of 69 responses, 70 responses, about 63% of you neither agree nor disagree. And it looks like, again, I'm colorblind, so Google Forms really needs to work on this here. It looks like most of you agree, and then some of you disagree, and no one strongly disagrees. That I can see, that's right. So no one strongly disagrees. Most people, many people agree or strongly agree, and the majority neither agree nor disagree. So perhaps we have some room to change some minds through the course of this debate today. To begin, I am again thrilled to have a friend from way back in our Iowa days, Jen, to kick us off. So Jen, I'll pass it to you. I'll let you handle all your own introductions, but thank you again for engaging in this debate. I'm going to be a stickler when it comes to time, as my colleagues already know. So everyone's got around 8 minutes, and then we hope to have time for lively debate and discussion. So Jen, off to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Andrew. All right, I am Jen Beimers. I'm going to be providing an overview of evidence-based standard setting, and this is based on an article that I co-authored with Katie McClarty, Denny Way, Andrew Porter, and Julie Miles that Andrew referenced way back in 2013. In the early 2000s, content-based standard setting methodologies like NGOF and Bookmark were well established, but then there was this interest in having college readiness be a part of the performance level descriptors. Instead of performance levels reflecting only students' knowledge and skill levels, there was also a desire to have college readiness be reflected. In addition, with NCLB, standard settings were being done for consecutive grades, so for example, 3 through 8 math, and there was a need for coherence in the progression of cut scores across the grades. Ed Hartle proposed an alternate approach by suggesting that policymakers and stakeholders use a briefing book of available data to set standards. Evidence-based standard setting, or EBSS, is an extension of that idea, just taking multiple pieces of evidence or data and looking for convergence. As with any standard methodology, EBSS has variations and can be modified as needed. But at a high level, it can be described in these 5 steps. So number 1, define the outcome or outcomes of interest. So for example, college readiness. Step 2, develop research, data collection, and analysis plans. And this step is so critical in making sure you have access to the data you need, you have a way to merge students if you're tracking them through college, data privacy issues, making sure you have all those issues addressed. And then once you get the data, having time in the schedule, because usually we're working under such short, condensed timelines, making sure you have time to do what you need to do in order to support the standard setting. Once you have all your results in step 3, synthesizing the research can be challenging, and having it in a way that's easy for panelists to digest and interpret, especially if they're not as familiar with data or as comfortable with it as others. So that's a really critical step too, just making sure you can summarize it and having it in a meaningful way. Step 4, conduct the actual standard setting meeting with panelists. So this is where you would present all the data and panelists would make recommendations as to where they would suggest the cut scores being. Step 5, continue to gather evidence in support of the standard. If we're talking college readiness, then perhaps you would follow some students into college courses, see which courses they take and what grades they receive. This is an example from the American Diploma Project Algebra 2 standard setting. And there are a couple keys here I want to describe. There are abbreviations down here in the bottom left. AL is algebra, PC is pre-calculus. They looked at those 2 courses as being introductory math courses for college. And then they also looked at 3 different institution types. CC is community college, 4T is the 4-year typical, 4S is 4-year more selective. And then on the right, you can see the different types of studies. So the gray boxes are the national concurrent studies. Up here, you can see they looked at the relationship with ACT. The white boxes were predictive, and that's where they were looking at college performance in relation to performance on the test. And then the black boxes are judgment studies, which were more traditional content-based exercises. And then you can see the scale score here in the middle, raw score, 10 to 50. And this is just a way of summarizing and showing where all the different data points line up and how they compare to each other. A few challenges to note: having sufficient evidence. If we're talking about convergence, we want to have multiple pieces of data to look and see feel good about where the data are converging. Like I said before, data privacy can be an issue, time, schedule. There are definitely challenges in being able to collect all the data and analyze it in the timeline that you have. Presentation of data can also cause challenges. If you're doing several research studies, there may be some you feel better about than others. Maybe you have a more robust study, you feel better about the design and number of participants, and you think more weight should be given to that study perhaps, versus another study that has a handful of participants. So being able to convey that to participants can be challenging. And then also EBSS may recognize greater complexity than policymakers want. So if we're talking about college readiness, are you talking about being ready for algebra or pre-calculus? Are you talking about being ready for community college, a more selective university? Or is it different in different states? Are we talking about just in the particular state you're setting standards in, or across the country, for example? EBSS in practice, so the example I've been talking about is the ADP Algebra 2 exam, where they set a college readiness cut. Texas also used EBSS. They wanted an aligned system of performance standards, so they started with English 3 and Algebra 2 and worked backwards to grade 3. But I would say in terms of the current trends in K-12, most states tend to stick with a content-based methodology, but they are pulling in additional data sources to provide context. So for example, after round 1 of a standard setting, they might pull in ACT or SAT information just to provide context in a sense of where other measures might be pointing to a college readiness cut, for example. Or some states may look at the data prior to the actual meeting and set a range of the scale that panelists are allowed to work in. So maybe based on some external measures, a raw score of 40 tends to be where you would expect college readiness cut to be. And maybe panelists going in have a range around that with which to work. And the reason for doing that is just, again, with this idea of convergence, making sure data sources point in the same direction when they should, right? There might be a reason that one measure says 30% of students are ready for college and another measure says 80%, but you better be ready to explain that. So in terms of, again, the current trends in K-12, I would say content-based, but pulling in pieces of evidence. So that is my quick overview of EBSS, and I will turn it over to Wayne now.
That was like a perfect 8 minutes. Very well done.
On the dot.
Setting a tough standard for the rest of the participants. Wayne, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey folks, can you see my screen right now?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, so I'd like to talk to you a little bit about predictive standard setting, which is a variation of what Jen just covered. And the reason we're talking about this is the graph that I'm illustrating right here. This is where we were not that long ago, where states were using content-based standard setting to set the proficient or basic or below basic cut scores. And so it illustrates, I know it's small print and it's one that Bob Lynn gets a lot of credit for, but others have replicated this. It shows where the state cut score for proficient was on 8th grade NAEP math, and that's the blue line. The gold line is where the NAEP proficient would be on 8th grade NAEP math. And so you can see the gap sometimes. For example, Alabama, the gap goes from about 19% to about 80%. And so the huge fluctuations between where NAEP said a state was in terms of 8th grade proficient and where the state said they were in terms of state test performance was all over the place. And 3 red lines illustrate places, unusual states, where their state test was more strict, more conservative than what NAEP had shown. But generally, it meant that by setting content-based standards, we're basically replicating error. We're allowing a lot of educated SMEs to debate and use consensus judgments. But at the end of the day, it has very little meaning if the results are so disparate. And so predictive or empirical-based standard setting works in some cases, not all. Maybe the content-based standard setting is more appropriate, but I begin on the right-hand side where I look at the industrial organization literature that provides a lot of information, references about rate of accuracy and rate of halo effects and leniency effects. I also look back to a quote by Mark Reckes, who I think is on the program, who noted that data and feedback provided to panelists is often not appreciated, but is very important to the validity of the practice. And finally, if you look at decision-making research, decision theory research in cognition, in clinical diagnostics, in healthcare diagnosis, you find that empirical procedures are much more accurate than even very well trained and educated clinicians. So I think overall, if you've got the kind of evidence and you're trying to make inferences to outcome data and you have the data, I'm a big fan of using empirical data. The big difference between the briefing book and the evidence-based methods that Jen talked about is when ACT or SAT use predictive standard setting and maybe some state test, they're generally using one variable or maybe 2 or 3 variables, not as many sources of evidence. And I've done both. I've worked with Pearson and used the evidence-based standard setting. I like it. We did it in Texas for the STAR exam, but all the sources of data made it very cognitively complex issue to weight various sources differentially. We set standards all the time, performance levels for pass-fail, graduation tests, the AP exam, NAEP, and we do it through judgmental and empirical methods. Here are an example of simple empirical methods that have been used in other fields. To the left is really a widely used example, an expectancy table that's used for life insurance to set premiums. They do the same thing to set premiums in car insurance for boys versus females, for males versus females. And so it basically shows the survival rate of a 25-year-old or a 40-year-old or a 50-year-old or a 60-year-old who's a smoker and a not smoker. And so you see the probability of life expectancy for a 25-year-old to reach 70 years old. If they're a smoker, is 68%. If they're never been a smoker, it's probably about 85%. So again, it just gives probabilistic statements. On the right is something we did at the College Board with Maureen Ewan and Roger Millsap, where we looked at the PSAT total score, reading plus math, which would be go to 160 points and 40 to 160 point scale. And we just looked at what score would give you a probability of getting a 3 or higher, a 90% probability, an 80%, a 70%. So these kind of charts and these kind of expectancy tables are pretty well varied in most walks of life if you have a reliable outcome. What ACT did basically is we set standards for college career readiness, and we did it by looking at the probability of getting a grade in the requisite entry-level course. So in mathematics, the course that most students take is college algebra. We replicated this using college calculus for those in STEM. So again, you need to define your outcome in a practical and realistic manner. If you're looking for engineers and scientists, probably using college algebra is too weak an outcome. If you're looking at psychology, I hate to say it, or education or philosophy, then college algebra is probably the right benchmark to use for course. And so we do that in each subject. And here, basically, we show the ACT score across the x-axis, the probability of an A, B, or C across the y-axis, C being red, B being blue, and A being green. And you can see that ACT selected a 50% probability of a B or higher, which corresponds to about 75% probability of a C or higher. Now, as a panelist, you could move that line left or right, be more stringent, more weak, but it gives you an idea of the kind of hierarchical linear regression method that's used when you have one predictor. Here's what raters look at. We basically quantify the data that you just saw in that chart to a table. We ask them to spend a little bit of time looking at this and discuss what is college success. Is it a B or higher? Is it a C or higher? Hopefully it's not an A or higher, because they'll never be above 35%, no matter what score they get on the ACT or the SAT, because it's an infrequent occurrence. And then we give them, after they have a debate about that, we give them a little bit of impact data. This is a state that does worse than norm, worse than average, and you can see the impact, and they begin with a rating by highlighting one of these rows and discussing it. At the end of the standard setting, maybe after two or three rounds, we come up with this. I told at one point what the ACT benchmarks are. We've done this with 7 or 8 states. It rarely comes out that they adapt the ACT benchmarks. They tend to be systematic, 1 point above or 1 point below, but it shows a probability of an A, B, or C with what the state arrived at. It shows in that state what percent of all juniors would achieve that goal mark for 2 consecutive years. And then it shows it for the graduation class, which includes seniors and probably a little bit more heterogeneous group, because it includes students who are in private schools, home schools. Then we show it compared to the nation. And I think a good reference population is census states. There are about 15, 17 states that test virtually all juniors. And so comparing a census state with even Iowa, where we have an 80% probability participation rate, is a little bit weak. So you're much better off comparing it to all census states. Here's an example of something that Jen just showed you. It's a little bit more selective because we limit the amount of data we show you. The red just shows you, based on ACT, the probability of a B or higher in particular course grades, or college grades, or high school grades. The ACT is in green, ACT College Ready. There's our benchmark, ACT College Ready in the US versus the state. It also shows you a placement. If there's a placement test cut score that they use in the state, we bring that in. It may be higher or lower. We bring in NAEP, but again, for a high school test, NAEP has little utility because 8th grade is probably the best data we have. And then again, we can look at proficiency on the previous state test, raw scores, advanced cut scores on the state test, again, bringing in older data. So,
oh, sorry, I just said NAEP. That's how much is on my mind. 1 more minute, Wayne, if that's okay.
And so, to conclude, what do we look at in setting predictive standard setting? Is the predictive data the sole method you'll be using, or are you going to use multiple sources? What outcome data is most relevant? Is it course grades? Is it participation rate? What is the rationale for each data source? And is the population from that data source adequately representative of the population in the standard setting? What sources are most relevant, least relevant? What data can be conveyed to a panel in a clear and effective manner? And finally, as we all know in these issues, who serves on the panel? Is it content? Is it prediction? Is it higher ed perspectives? And what kind of training do you do? Thank you.
That was great. My applause is both for the content and for continuing to stay on time. Lori, I think you're up next. Great to see you, and thank you again.
Yeah, thank you all very much. I'm gonna start my own timer, Andrew, because that will help me stay on time. All right, well, I'm gonna talk to you guys from a little bit of a higher level perspective about predictive standard setting. I have done so many standard settings, I stopped counting at 50. I really don't know how many I've facilitated. I have done some that are purely content-based. I have done some that are evidence-based standard setting. And I've even done a couple which were purely empirical. And so the first thing I want to talk to you about is when we talk about predictive standard setting, predictive to what? You've seen a lot of reference to college readiness as the sort of predictive outcome, but I think it's important to keep in mind that there's a lot of other data points out there that you could be considering as you're talking about your predictive statement. So I kind of put these into two buckets. The first are what I'm classifying as measures that are internal to the assessment system. So what cut score would I set on the third grade test if I want the student to be on track to be proficient for the fourth grade test? And so if I want those two cuts, adjacent years, to align, that is predicting. That's a predictive piece of data. What about status at a certain point of time? What if I want to look ahead 2 or 3 or 4 years to see, are we going to be proficient by the 5th grade or by the 8th grade? What if, in the case of an assessment like iReady, you want to look at what is the success going to be, not necessarily on the next assessment, but in the instructional materials that you are routing students into? What would we want to do to make sure that students are going to be appropriately challenged in that lesson pathway? So all of these are internal sources of predictive information, which arguably I think is less controversial than some of the external sources. This is very much like the vertical articulation process that you normally go through in a purely content-based standard setting. You want to make sure that grade to grade, that things within the system are lined up and that you don't have standards that are higher at one grade or than another, or that are out of alignment with important pieces of your system. The second bucket is measures that are external to the system, performance on a different assessment. So looking at NAEP, at Smarter Balanced, if you're an interim assessment, looking at the state summative tests. Are you meeting college readiness benchmarks? All of those are external measures which also serve a predictive value and which are arguably important to consider. However, equally important to consider is the alignment. When you are working outside of your assessment system, how much should you rely on these external sources of information? How much is the test measuring the same thing? What performance level on Smarter Balanced is equivalent to the performance level on NAEP? And so there's a whole host of decisions that have to be made before you can even engage in this discussion of predictive standard setting to determine what you're predicting. And if you're going outside of your assessment, what is the way to contemplate the construct relevance and the alignment of performance levels. And that's a really important step before you can get to some of the stuff that Jen and Wayne were talking about. So I've kind of done this as a continuum. So you can think about standard setting as being either entirely predictive, which is sort of looking at just the data. You can think about it as being entirely content driven. And then there's all this stuff in the middle. And so evidence-based standard setting is not just one thing. Wayne and Jen have both talked about a very specific way in which it's used, and they presented sort of those charts that showed all the boxes pointing to points on the scale. And that is what you would do typically if you want to use it to set reasonable ranges for your cut scores. You would look at where things line up and you can say, okay, my cut scores are somewhere in this range. Now I will go to my panelists and I will ask them to weigh in on this information. You can also use it to inform panelists as they are going through their process. So I might not constrain the judgments at all to say my cut scores are in this range. I might just say to panelists, here's where your cut scores would land you. Here's what NAEP tells us would be expected. And so let the panelists sort of use that information and make their adjustments in their ratings accordingly. You can also use it after the fact. So we have both pre and post policy meetings as concepts. And so standard setting in this role as incorporating predictive information is not just the meeting with the educators. In fact, it really shouldn't be. It's a whole process that occurs across multiple months where you have lots of discussions up front about how to use this data, and you have lots of discussions after the fact about what adjustments should we make. And so all of these options are available to you, and you can use this in a number of different ways with a number of different audiences before, during, and after your educator meetings. How do I make these choices? How do I decide what pieces of predictive evidence I want to include and how I want to include it in my process? I want to really encourage you to look at what do your performance levels mean? How are the policy descriptors defining your performance levels? So I've got two examples here from Smarter Balanced. Level 2 for high school and level 4 for grades 6 through 8. And you can see in the purple text that the policy descriptors for these levels explicitly call out some relationship to an external measure, an external outcome. Success in entry-level college, credit-bearing college course, success in future coursework. And so when you have an explicit definition provided to you, that helps to direct this information. By contrast, in the iReady diagnostic policy descriptors, we talk about meeting expectations for college and career readiness standards in the student's grade level. However, we aren't explicitly calling out the external outcomes to define that. It is really more standards referenced in how we think about that. So that would lean us towards a different way of using the predictive information. We might be able to use it a little less directly, but nonetheless reference it. Big, super important point. When you're doing prediction, you have error, and you don't just have a little error or one source of error. You have every source of error you can probably conceive of. You've got measurement error in both your test and the test that you are predicting your outcome to. You've got a sampling error, restriction of range, bias, I didn't even know what to call it. Basically, you generally have to have two groups of kids who take both assessments or some way to relate them, and that group might not be representative or random. You have to think about the time in between the measures. If I am using an interim assessment that's given in the fall to predict a summative assessment that's given in the spring, that distance and the amount of educational progress that students will make in that time influences that relationship. You also have to think about, when was this relationship established? If I want to go back and use data that was pulled in 2013 and it's now 2020, I have to question the quality and the relevance of that data. What if I had a change? What if this data was more recent? What if it was collected last year, but now we have a change in conditions, like, I don't know, COVID, where we are now changing what we're assessing in the test or how we're assessing it. And then we have to think about prediction at the level at which we're aggregating. You'll have a different level of error if you're talking about individual students versus if you're trying to predict what's going to happen for a school, a district, or a state. So being aware of all of this is majorly important. So, perfect. On my last slide, what I want to leave you with. I strongly believe predictive information should be referenced in standard setting, but you have to acknowledge and be aware of the limitations of this information. Where is it aligned? Where is it not aligned? What are your sources of error? What is the quality of that prediction? I think that predictive information is best used by policymakers and stakeholders rather than by educators. I think we should share with educators what we are doing, that we are going to have predictive information, who's going to use it and how, but I really want to argue that we should keep the judgment task that we are asking educators to do purely content driven. They are not policymakers. They are not trained to be consumers of this information. Let's be transparent with them about how that we're using this information, but let's not ask them to use information that they are not trained on. And then lastly, we really need to incorporate this information to avoid what is commonly called the honesty gap. This is a term that Achieve coined to describe the discrepancy that Wayne showed between having 80% proficient on your state summative test and closer to 30 or 40% proficient on an assessment like NAEP, which has a higher standard. There's an important equity argument to be made here. And I think that's the one thing I'm going to leave you with, which is that while all of this predictive information is difficult to use and controversial, we can't ignore it. We need to make sure that we are giving students a message about their level of success that is realistic. And if we just ignore what is happening in the rest of the world and only focus on the content, we are at risk of setting expectations that are out of alignment with what they're going to face in the real world and in college. So there's an equity argument that we need to make in order to incorporate this information, and it's just a question of the best way to do that. All right, thank you.
Wonderful, Lori. Thank you so much. Now we'll pass it off to. I was gonna add this riff in the chat, but yeah. Well, I think Laura is up next, and Laura, we go way back, but also thank you so much for representing the National Academies in this report as well, and I look forward to your presentation.
Thanks so much for including me in this, Andrew. Can everybody see the slides? Okay, great. I've done this 5,000 times and I'm always convinced it won't work. So I am going to do a whirlwind overview of the 2017 National Academies report on evaluating the NAEP achievement levels. And then I'll focus on a few parts of the report that are relevant to the discussion that we're having today. So full disclosure, I am not a standard setting expert, but I'm very interested in how test results get interpreted and used to inform decisions at various levels of the education system. So my work on the committee focused on the topic of how the levels were interpreted and used, and my remarks today will reflect that perspective. So I want to first share the list of committee members, since what I'll present today reflects a collaborative effort among the members of this group. Special thanks to our chair, Chris Edley, who ably herded this group of cats, and to Judy Koenig at the National Academies, who did just a heroic amount of work and ensured that this group stuck to our task and met deadlines. That cannot have been easy. So this is the first half of the alphabet. I'll keep it up for a few seconds so you have a chance to read through it. Not too long, because I know I got my timekeeper watching me. And then here's the rest of the committee. And so you can see that the members represented a variety of roles and different areas of expertise. Okay, so what was the committee asked to do? The question at hand was specifically about the achievement levels in reading and math. As you might know, there had been kind of an asterisk next to the reports of achievement level results because they were considered provisional for a long time. So in some ways, this whole effort with many meetings that resulted in a 100-something page report was intended to remove that asterisk, and we did it. So you can see we're looking at 4 broad topics. Predictive standard setting is related to validity and reliability, of course, but also to questions about reasonableness and how the levels can be helpful for informing the public. So what does it mean when we say that 60% of a state students scored at the proficient level or above? What inferences can policymakers or the public take away from that statistic about how prepared students are for whatever comes next? So we started from the policy statement about what the levels are intended to be used for. There are a few key phrases to pay attention to here. The levels are intended to signify what students should know and should be able to do. So they're aspirational and ideally would reflect something resembling a consensus about what students need to be successful. And they should make the NAEP data more understandable to several different audiences. So this is all relevant to the topic of predictive standard setting because many of the inferences people would like to make probably have to do with future performance. We gathered a variety of information, reviewing existing research and evidence and examining how members of various groups interpret and use the achievement levels. An especially informative activity was a workshop we held with education journalists, leaders of professional organizations, and others to hear from stakeholders about the value of the achievement levels and how they and the groups they serve make sense of them. 2 things came through. First, the levels are absolutely essential for communicating clearly about what NAEP scores mean. And second, misinterpretation of the levels is widespread. So we examined numerous sources of criterion-related validity evidence among all of the other stuff we looked at. The evidence that's most relevant to the topic of today's session is a set of studies that have been done looking at relationships between the NAEP achievement levels and other measures. The bulk of these studies examined concurrent measures like the ones listed here. So the state tests, that chart that Wayne showed falls in here, international exams and AP exams for 12th graders. We didn't really see much that involved predictive relationships. So the predictive evidence I'll talk about today is based on relationships with college admissions tests taken at roughly the same time as NAEP was administered, but because these tests themselves are intended to predict future college readiness, we can think of this as a type of predictive standard setting. Same logic might apply to the AP exams, and I'm happy to talk about those analyses during the discussion if there's interest. The analysis I'll describe very briefly was sponsored by the governing board and conducted in collaboration with the College Board. It was designed to determine what NAEP math and reading scores would predict college readiness by exploring relationships with the SAT. So I'm not able to delve into the details of the methods here because I am really intimidated by the timekeeper. He scares me. But you can see in more detail in citations to the original work in the report. The first step was to develop a definition of academic preparedness. And so I'm going to read you that definition. Academic preparedness for college refers to the reading and mathematics knowledge and skills needed to qualify for placement into entry-level, credit-bearing, non-remedial courses that meet general education degree requirements in broad access four-year institutions and for 2-year institutions for entry-level placement without remediation into degree-bearing programs designed to transfer to 4-year institutions. Did you get all that? So the researchers then conducted statistical linking to determine the NAEP scale scores that corresponded with SAT college readiness benchmarks using a score of 500 as a benchmark. And so the key results really were that academic preparedness score for reading is at the cut score for proficient, which suggests that it might be reasonable to interpret proficient on NAEP as college ready, talking about 12th grade again. The academic preparedness score for mathematics falls 7 points below the proficient cut score, so at the upper end of the basic level. The committee wrote that the math result was puzzling and that for both reading and math, more evidence is needed to determine the specific inferences that are warranted. And I know I have 1 minute left. And so is this madness? Probably not, but it's definitely hard. The committee concluded more such research should be done, but there are numerous challenges. So back to that long definition of academic preparedness, it is essential for this type of linking study to develop a precise definition of what a benchmark means. But as the specificity of that description demonstrates, it doesn't apply to all contexts in which college readiness is relevant, and it probably doesn't accurately reflect readiness to succeed at different institutions or in different majors. This limitation is inherent in these types of studies, and one key challenge for the measurement community is to communicate clearly about this with users of the results. Also, lack of evidence related to non-college going students for whom the SAT might not be a relevant measure. So, for example, students in CTE programs who will pursue a technical certification. 4th and 8th grade studies would be useful, but we need to figure out what we want students to be ready for and then identify reasonable criterion measures. Lori provided a really helpful list of sources of error, so I don't need to talk about that, but it's a consideration. And of course, there's always the concern about treating any criterion measure as a gold standard and assuming lack of predictive power reflects flaws in the measure being studied. These analyses require nuanced interpretation and ideally replication with different samples and different measures. So I will leave it at that and turn it over to whomever is next. Thank you.
That was fantastic, Laura. Thank you so much. We've got Deanna up next, and then EC, and then we'll have a little bit of debate, and then we'll throw it open to the audience. And I should add, don't forget, do not leave at 5:30 because that's when our social hour starts, where the debate will, I am sure, really get going. But I am passing that to Deanna, and again, Deanna, thank you for joining us. Still on mute, Deanna.
Okay, hopefully you can hear me now and see my slides. So a lot of what I plan to share has been touched on previously, but not everything. So we will go through this. I do want to start by just saying that while I'm an employee of the College Board, these are my own opinions and thoughts and not necessarily those of the College Board, so keep that in mind. I feel like so I guess my title here sort of shows my stance on this. You know, I think there's a time and a place for everything. I'm not a big proponent of predictive standard setting, but I do think it has its uses in certain situations, and we'll talk a little bit about my thoughts on this and why I'm not a huge proponent, but also where I do think it has a place. And as others have stated on here, I've done a lot of standard setting, and I've done it using predictive data and not using predictive data, and you know, everything works at some point in time. So we just have to see what fits. So I guess this slide starts with capturing some of the problems I have with thinking about predictive standard setting. And a lot of it's just the fact that it's a normative approach. I don't know about all of you, but you know, if I'm on an airplane, I'd like to know the pilot knows a certain amount of knowledge about flying. I don't just want them to be the best pilot who passed the course. You know, I'm not looking for them to do as well as people who also did well. I actually want to know, can they fly the plane? So to me, that's one of my biggest criticisms is with predictive data, especially when it's used in isolation, is that oftentimes it seems that it becomes more of a pick a number exercise and a comparison to these people did well, so if you're similar, you'll probably do well too, without any definite link to content. Often that link to content is very tenuous. So that's probably one of my biggest things. Also, there's often a reliance upon class grades in many of the predictive models. Not always, but fairly often. And we know, I think we can all agree, that class grades tend to be inflated, often by factors that are not academic, such as participation and teacher-pleasing ability and other such characteristics that really don't have anything to do with how much you know and can do of the content matter. So I worry about that, and also about the fact that they're really not very standardized. If I go to Ms. Jones' class and see what it takes to get an A, and then I go next door to Mr. Smith's class, chances are it is not the same thing. Even if they're teaching the same course, they oftentimes have very different criteria for who gets an A. So an A is not an A in every situation. So that is another thing that concerns me. And then we get to a couple of different things. First of all, how do you decide what your level of success is? Why do you use a C or higher, or a B or higher? You know, how do you defend that choice? And then once you've decided whether it's a B or a C, what about the percent chance? Is it 50%? Is it 70? Is it 75? Is it 80? So all those are decisions that I think are kind of hard to defend. And anytime I think about standard setting, always in the back of my mind is defensibility. And if it was challenged, how I would defend this in court. And I think it's kind of difficult to defend whether you've chosen a 70 or a 75 or an 80 as your percent probability for success. So that does worry me. And again, when it's used in isolation, sometimes meaning that there's not any kind of expert judgment, that they strictly do the predictive analysis and then come up with some numbers. And then it becomes sort of a, well, which one do we like? Which one do we pick? I think it's hard to defend what's been picked if you don't have subject matter experts involved to help make that link to the knowledge, skills, and abilities. And I know from the evidence-based standard setting meetings that I've had the opportunity to be involved in, it really did become a, well, do we like this number or this number? And there was very little consideration or discussion of content, even though we had subject matter experts at the table. And so that concerns me. I think it's very important that we have that tie to content. And then that gets to my next point, is oftentimes in these situations, there are no performance level descriptors guiding this discussion. And it ends up being sort of a back mapping where you figure out the number you want, and then you go back and try to say, well, what does that mean? What can they do? What do they know? You know, to me, that's a little like the cart driving the horse. Isn't that kind of backwards? Shouldn't we figure out what they need to know and do to be successful, and then figure out what that means numerically? You know, it just seems like a backwards process to me, and that bothers me. So, but there are times when predictive data, I think, can be used, should be used. I'm not completely against it. And so I think it's important when you're doing a panel-based standard setting, I like to make sure that we bring in predictive data as feedback to give some information to the panelists, but I only like to do it after there's been a round or two of judgment based upon content, so they have a firm grounding in content, and then this comes in as a reality check to see if they're on the right path.
Deanna, I'm tempted to give you more time because I agree with you, but but at the risk of being unfair to my other colleagues, 1 more minute, and then
Great.
we should get on to the next one.
No problem, no problem. So I think it's good to use predictive data as an input after the grounding and content has been established. I also think it's a great way to validate results after the fact. You've implemented your cut scores and you want to check on them and see how things are working. In situations where you just don't have the ability to conduct a panel-based standard setting due to time, resources, what have you, I think it's okay as a starting point, a temporary threshold, but not something I'd want to hang my hat on for the future. And I think it's also okay to use it as a starting point if the panel is going to verify it, meaning they're going to compare it to the performance level descriptors and see, does it match up with what it should. This was mentioned by someone earlier. I think one of the more appropriate places for this is at a policy meeting to use to adjust the recommended cut scores, as long as you stay within an acceptable range as is supported by the SEM or standard error of judgment, or maybe to define the location of cut score ranges within which the panelists then would work based on content. So I'm not saying it's not okay. There are places, but I think you have to think about where it makes sense and not go whole hog into predictive standard setting. So I'll turn it over to you, Andrew.
That was wonderful, Deanna. Great set of bullets there. All right, now calling in from Singapore with a so far surprisingly good internet connection. Let's knock on wood. EC, thank you very much for joining us, and we will pass it on to you. After this, I'll just have a quick round of debate among fellow panelists. We'll kick it open to the full group to ask questions, and feel free to use the chat for that. And then we'll have a final poll and see where we all stand at least before the drinks start flowing at 5:30 Eastern. All right, off to you, EC.
Thank you, Andrew. Happy to be here. I'm EC from Singapore, and what I'm sharing with you today is based on the work that I did with my advisor, Andrew, at Harvard. And in this presentation, we will address 3 claims of evidence-based standard setting, or EBSS in short, with a particular focus on predictive standard setting. And here's a recap of the claims and our responses. One key advantage claimed by EBSS is that it removes a great deal of arbitrariness in standard setting. But we will argue that EBSS requires substantial judgment, and it matters because different choices can lead to very different cut scores. The second claim in EBSS, and the focus of our presentation today, is that evidence in the form of the likelihood of college success is highly relevant for standard setting. However, we are going to argue that imperfect test correlations act as an invisible hand to influence all regression-based relationships. So no matter how relevant external criterion scores seem, the evidence generated is going to be distorted and misleading. And finally, EBSS claims that the converging pattern of validity evidence can be quite convincing. In principle, while this is true, it follows from our second argument that the convergence of distorted evidence can actually be more misleading than helpful. And this, we hope, can frame our discussion of how empirical evidence might be used for achievement levels. Let's start with predictive benchmarks that you've already seen. These benchmarks predict the likelihood of college success. And these are examples for ACT and SAT. What we would like to suggest is that these statements reflect built-in judgments, and the selection of a future criterion score, B or C, and the likelihood of success, 50%, 75%, or any other probability, is going to affect the location of the cut score. And in fact, there's an infinite combination of the future criterion score and the probability of prediction that can be used to justify any cut score. Moreover, predictive benchmarks rely heavily on logistic regression. And as it turns out, using regression-based methods matters a great deal because predictive cut scores identified by regression-based methods are distorted by predictor outcome test correlations. For our illustration, we use the simple case of OLS regression. The equations for logistic regression are a little bit more complicated, but you can refer to the working paper by Andrew. But the point is that logistic regression, on which EBSS is hugely reliant on, is similarly dependent on correlation. So let's say the desired future criterion score is YC. For reference, we can use the equipercentile linking method to identify an equal stringency reference, X-equi, that has the same passing percentage on both the current predictor score scale and the future outcome score scale, shown in equation 1. And following simple linear regression relationships, we can write out the left half of equation 2 and substitute in X-equi for YC. And what equation 2 implies is that the OLS regression cut score will always be skewed away from the equal stringency reference by a factor of 1 over rho, the correlation value. And the implication is that predictive cut scores are particularly unsuitable for standard setting because the regression-based cut scores are influenced not only by the stringency of performance required by the future criterion score, which is desired, but is also influenced by the correlation between the current predictor and future outcome test, which is not desired. And what this means is when the future criterion score is below average, the regression-based cut score will be more lenient than the equal stringency reference. But when the future criterion score is above average, the regression-based cut score will be more stringent than the equal stringency reference. And we will illustrate this in the next couple of slides. All right, so this series of illustrations using scatter plots shows the effects of correlation on the predictive cut score when the future criterion score is below average, say C. X and Y are bivariate normal distributions. The x-axis shows the current score on the test on which we are setting cut scores. The y-axis shows the future score. And we start out with a relatively high correlation of 0.9. The diagonal solid line through the plot shows the equipercentile linking line, while the dashed line shows the OLS fitted line. And this is the future criterion score that we're predicting. And this is the regression-based predictive cut score. All right, and watch what happens to this predictive cut score as the correlation becomes weaker, even as the future criterion score stays the same. As the correlation gets weaker, the predictive cut score gets more and more lenient. And what this illustration shows is that the correlation between the current and future score affects the location of the predictive cut score. And we are able to show this effect here through a series of hypothetical correlations. But when all we have is a given pair of predictor and outcome test with a given correlation, the correlation acts like an invisible hand that you can't see, but is always there to influence the location of the cut score. What we also need to remember is that using poor predictive tests impose a cost on students. When the future criterion score is below the mean, imperfect correlation grants students a leniency discount, and students have to meet lower standards to compensate for poorer prediction. And when the future criterion score is above the mean, imperfect correlation levies on students a stringency premium that students have to meet higher standards to compensate for poorer prediction. And this is the price paid when external tests are being elevated from being a source of external validity information to being directly incorporated as the basis for identifying cut scores. Lastly, what does distorted evidence imply when they converge? You've seen this figure earlier in the first presentation. It's reproduced from the McClarty et al. Paper. and it's used to provide a visual summary of where cut scores identified from various methods tend to converge. What we've argued so far is that imperfect correlations give rise to distorted evidence. And when a series of studies based on predictive relationships characterized by poor prediction is presented, we will get distorted evidence. And when that happens, convergence of distorted evidence is likely going to be misleading. And so for every study, we need to make the strength of correlation and imperfect prediction a key part of this picture. And with so many studies, this is going to require quite a bit of mental acrobatics. So in conclusion, right, correlations matter. Poor prediction imposes a cost in terms of a leniency discount or stringency premium on students. And consensus built on distorted evidence will be misled. So I leave you with this thought for the discussion later. Because of the misleading nature of predictive statements, we propose that if empirical evidence were to be used, we should set cut scores judgmentally first, and then attach empirical statements after the fact to judgmentally define cut scores. And even so, we need to be aware of the misleading nature of predictive statements. Thank you.
That was great, Yisi. Thank you so much. And again, I'm very impressed. You did what I could not do, which is end a presentation on time. So to all of you, my gratitude for your respect for each other's time and the audience's time. And again, we hope to engage you all with your own questions. Am I still here? Yes, I am. I hope to engage you all with your own questions shortly. But I do want to pose to start, and again, this is a biased moderator, right? I'm a co-author on a paper taking a position, but I will nonetheless try to be neutral. So after seeing Yisi's presentation and hearing, it's sort of slowly trended more skeptical of predictive standard setting. And so I guess I'd pass it back to those who presented earlier, perhaps Jen or Wayne, and then we can open it to a full discussion. So do you agree that interpreting a predictive standard accurately requires the impossible mental acrobatics that Yisi mentioned, right? A juggling of the stringency of the outcome and this sort of invisible hand, this predictive relationship between the test and the outcome?
No, I think I feel like I was listening to the Republican convention. And unfortunately, people are going to have to vote, and they may not like the Democratic choice, and they can come up with all the arguments, but they've got to vote one way or the other. And I find it humorous that Dina, who I know very well, and Yi, who I don't know as well, but all the criticisms were based on the problems with empirical data, which I will admit they got a lot of them right. I didn't hear any defense of judgmental processes because there are no defenses. So I mean, so you've got to do standard setting one way or the other. So we can do it with the flawed out way that's not replicable and not transparent. And then we can bring data in to try to straighten it out after the fact, or we can try to do it in a more robust and truthful manner. I think what empirical data does is it makes things transparent and it puts them on the table. And it's replicable. So two panels may disagree whether it's a B or a C, or they may disagree whether it's 60% or 70%, but those things are out in front and we can take issue with them. I can't take issue with a reading panel that says the cut score on a 100-point scale is 50 for proficient and another one says it's 55. Well, how do I validate that? What's the transparency? The validity evidence to support judgmental processes is based on who is on the panel and the training. That's not validity evidence. That's excuses. So I understand the role of different data sources, but judgmental panel setting, until you can show me that the conclusions are replicable within some degree of consistency, I don't really feel it's useful. It is useful when there's no outcome. When there's no outcome and you just set standards to have fun on a Saturday afternoon, then I think judgmental standard setting is fine.
This is fantastic, and you can see in the audience we've already got the firecrackers cracking. So this is great. As always, we attack the argument, not the person. Let's just keep it civil, and as I know we always do. Jen, I'd love to hear your take on this. That was great, Wayne.
Yeah, I think we need to keep in mind what our reporting goals are. what do we want these student score reports to say and support? So are we saying, you know, are we explicit in saying, hey, we think that this cut score is reflective of college readiness as defined, you know, this way, in addition to any of those, you know, skills and abilities that students can do. So I really think it's important to tie it back to what your score reports are going to say, and make sure you can defend that information in there.
This is great. Deanna, Lori, Laura?
Yeah, I guess I would just say that if you've never been on a standard setting panel, facilitated a standard setting panel, you may not appreciate how truly judgmental the judgments are. I am frequently saying that standard setting is the least psychometric work that I do. I have been in difficult situations as a standard setting facilitator where the outcome from the panel judgments using the standard setting method is inconsistent with the policy goals of the stakeholders. And one instant in particular where the policyholder got up in the middle of the committee meeting and told the panelists they were wrong, which then completely eroded any rapport or trust in the process that we had built with the panelists. So I would argue that I very much value the subject matter expertise. I do have a value for the content judgment, but I think it has to be tempered by the reality that it is not without error either. I listed all the sources of error of the predictive stuff. I didn't list all the sources of error that go into the content judgments, which arguably I should have done. So we have to keep that in mind. And we also have to keep in mind that we live in the real world where if we don't have an answer that is acceptable, we will undermine the validity of the entire process.
Yeah, I'll just add to that, you know, one of the things we found when we did the kind of stakeholder workshop for the NAEP study is that, you know, not surprisingly, if you say this performance we're calling this proficient, the inference that's often made is that, oh, that student who scores proficient must be college ready. Now, NAEP doesn't provide individual student scores, but it's a similar kind of inference. So, you know, similarly, if you say a fourth grader's proficient, there's some notion that they are, you know, grade level is often the inference that's made, but there's some inference that they're, you know, doing fine and they're ready for whatever comes next. So to the extent that you can bring additional empirical data to support those inferences that people are already making seems valuable.
And I think if you think of the example that I gave early on, which was life expectancy and studying insurance rates or automobile rates, it's a pretty simple example. You look at smoking and non-smoking and you age and body weight, and you can kind of come up with a statistical model. Now, one can criticize those models, and these panelists certainly could. They could tell me that I'm leaving out environmental hazards, geographical, economic factors. And so we can build really complex models to predict life expectancy, but a simple model that's used by life insurance or automotive insurance companies that's using one or two predictors and setting rates because it's transparent and it's easily understood is useful in those examples because it's transparent and it's simple, and we're trying to set it on an outcome that is direct. When you're looking at outcomes that are not direct, so career readiness is a good example. Nobody has any business predicting career readiness. There's no outcome variable that works. So the major testing organization, probably 49 states, have no body of evidence to cite when they talk about career evidence. And many examples in education, we're looking at more than college readiness. So it probably is not appropriate. The one thing I would add also is certainly people brought up the fact of grades, and although grades are not quite as bad in college as they are in high school, but what score would it be at Harvard to get in and be successful? Well, you know, it wouldn't work at Harvard because you don't admit anybody with average scores pretty much so. But if you look at the cut scores that SATC use, they're averages across 2 or 4 year colleges. Quite frankly, the research shows that they hold up pretty well across most colleges, not the highly selective ones, but most colleges. And the example of what we tried to do is that they don't hold up well for majors. So we had to set cut scores for STEM because, quite frankly, a math cut score of 22 on the ACT wouldn't allow you to get into any engineering program, even in a less selective college. So there are certainly valid criticisms of overuse of the college readiness benchmarks, and so I would agree with them. And some hybrid model may make sense as well.
Deanna, you see, I want to push it back to you, and then I've got another question.
Sure. Well, I agree. Nothing's perfect, and there are criticisms to be made of panel-based standard setting, just like predictive standard setting. But I think in the end, it's not just about a number on a score report, it's what that number represents in terms of what we say that student knows and can do. And I think too often in predictive standard setting, that link gets lost. And that concerns me a lot because I know, we have a problem in that, much like I think it was Laurie's last bullet point, where students get through high school and then they have to take remedial courses because they aren't prepared, even though maybe they got an A in high school, but they can't do the work, and so I think we have to keep that tie to content and what students know and can do in there. And while the predictive data may be useful and informative, I think you have to have those experts in there who know the content to make sure that when we set a standard, that it means something, that these students can actually do something, and too often that link is not there in the predictive standard setting situations that I've been a part of.
This is great. I'll pass it to EC for a rejoinder.
Yeah, I think what we are not here to do today is to defend judgmental standard setting and wishing all its problems would go away. But what we'd like to do is to point out some of the critiques of predictive standard setting, which is so much a part of evidence-based standard setting. And I think the thing is, whenever you bring in evidence, people sit up and they think that, oh, it's objective and it might matter more than judgment. But the other thing is, I think I fully agree with Deanna that with judgmental standard setting, at least you have that view on the content and what students should know and be able to do. What does it mean in terms of what they can do when we say that they are college ready? And our concern is that that view might be lost if we rely on evidence, particularly that from predictive standard setting. If I may, can I show a slide? Yeah. Let me just share a screen here. How do I do that? Are you able to see this? No. All right, this is from an empirical example where X is a standardized New York State high school test, standardized to mean 0 and 1. And this is the test score scale from 0 up to whatever. And the predicted outcome test is a first-year GPA from a state university exam. And the correlation is 0.4. This is the imperfect correlation we are talking about that you will always encounter in real life. They are always imperfect. And this is an example of a target criterion score, for example, FGPA of B, and this is above the mean. And what does that do to the predictive cut score compared to the equal stringency reference? And this is where the equal stringency reference would be 0.8. What this means is that students who score at this score point on the current test scored above 78% of students, as did those who scored the FGPA of B. They score above 78% of students. on the first year GPA. And here is where the predictive cut score will be. It's 1.5 standard deviations. And this gap is what we are talking about in terms of the stringency premium. That is the premium students have to pay, the extra clearance in terms of stringency they have to meet because of the poor predictive property of the test, 0.4. The correlation is not perfect. But my concern is when we put up these two candidate cut scores on a standard setting panel, and we tell them that, okay, this is a predictive cut score, and students have a 50% chance of scoring B or above on this cut score. And you present to them the equal stringency reference and tell them that this has a 35% chance of scoring B or above. What I fear is going to do is that it's going to skew people towards the predictive cut score, because if I am aiming for a criterion score of B, of course I will want to have students to have a higher percentage chance of clearing their target criterion score. But without that background understanding of what correlation does, is that it skews this predictive cut score upwards. They are not going to understand that actually what this does, the predictive cut score does, is that it actually makes it more stringent. And we can tell that when you look at the impact data. With the predictive cut score, the students will score about 93% above students on the current test, about only 7% of them going to pass. But with the accurate stringency reference, there will be higher percentage of them passing. And that is the invisible cost that we are imposing on students because of the poor predictive test. So that cost will be borne by students. When people look at that, they're going to say, oh, is it, if they have a very high percentage of fail rate or low percentage of pass rate, are they going to say that, well, because our students are not performing well, or are they going to say that the test is doing a terrible job of prediction? And what the predictive cut score does, it imbues that poor prediction of the test, which is a test property. It has nothing to do with the stringency of the performance required by the students, builds it into a cut score, and people are going to think that it's more believable. And I think that at the end of the day is my greatest fear when we bring in evidence-based cut scores into the standard setting process.
And I think that's a realistic risk, and it's a realistic concern, and it's hard to completely mitigate that concern. I mean, one of the things that we try to do, and one of the slides I showed you, we show panelists the probabilities from 90 percentile to 40 percentile of an A, B, and C. And you can see that there is absolutely no score on the score scale where you have a 50% probability of an A. Probably it doesn't get above a 35% probability of an A. And so it tries to, and panelists think, well, with an ACT, why can't I set it at 36? And why doesn't a 36 give me a 70% probability of an A? What's going on here? And it's that imprecision at score points that it's subtly, we can't explain it the way you've done it here, because panelists wouldn't get it, but it does try to drive that point home. So I think that's important. But I also think, again, we've got to get back to the choice. We've got to pick a methodology to use, and there are limitations with empirical standard setting. That's an important one. But with judgmental standard setting, I'm not going to concede that it's better for content. I think empirical standard setting's not great for content. You backward map, as you said, but the kind of evidence that I want for an empirical for judgmental PLD is when you tell me that a student who's advanced can solve quadratic equations with two missing variables. I want you to give me evidence of that. I don't want it based on students that you taught in class, because the students in New Rochelle and the students in Yonkers and the students in Long Island and the students in Albany are different students. So when you're doing a student-centered or an item mapping process, you have such widely disparate evidence. If you're going to tell me that advanced solves quadratic equations, then show me with evidence. And you can do it. You can have a mini quadratic equation test. You can give it to college students, and let me see if the student who's advanced can solve 3 of the 5 problems or 2 of the 5 problems. So it's a long way of going there, but that's the kind of evidence we demand in our field. When you're going to make evidence that a student at a particular PLD can do something, you have to show me that they can do it. You cannot point to, we've got experienced SMEs who were on the panel and we trained them well. That's not evidence. There's no evidence of replication. And there's no evidence that you're measuring the content.
This is wonderful, and I think it's going to be hard to keep from having a debate about standard setting, period. but yes, so I'd like to open it up to questions. I think G is coming in with a question here. So let's see, I think it's more to find a range for panelists to consider, will that be a better and happier middle ground? And I do think that that's what EBSS is proposing, right? Those two diagrams that you showed are about converging or establishing, what did you call it, a window or a range, right? And I guess my question would be, when you present those, right? EC was actually showing two different empirical methods. Right? One, an equipercentile method, an equal stringency method, and another, a regression method that has this I love Lisi's language here, the invisible hand, right? That pushes the cut score this way and that the interpreter of the cut score, the interpreter of the standard can't see. You don't interpret with a college benchmark, and then there's this correlation. There's no correlational statement in there. So I do wonder, when you present these to panelists, how do you distinguish between an equipercentile cut and a regression-based cut that has this invisible hand?
It's a really hard question, Andrew. So this is part of the reason why I argued that educators are not the appropriate consumers of this information, because I think this is particularly difficult to explain. Having said that, I'm not sure policymakers can understand the nuance of what you just suggested either. I think what you need is someone very skilled to do your predictive work, who can present this information. I know in the Texas method that Jen referenced in her presentation, we had sort of like a consumer reports guide to go with each piece of data. And I don't remember off the top of my head what all the categories were, but we rated each study we did based on quality and like 3 or 4 other factors to try to get it down to a level that policymakers could internalize and then make a judgment about how to use that information. But I think unless you are going to be purely empirical and have your psychometricians do the standard setting, you're going to have struggle with that question. Yeah, one other thought. When I talk about the ranges that we're establishing in evidence-based standard setting, the way I prefer to talk about them is to say what we're doing is establishing where the cut score is not, right? So we are eliminating areas where it simply doesn't make sense. It wouldn't make sense for the cut score to be this low or this high. So now here's a range in which it does make sense. Let's use our content judgments to refine where in that range the cut score belongs. And so having multiple points and multiple studies and multiple views of the data help you establish that range and keep it sufficiently broad that you aren't eliminating actual judgment from your process. But that's I don't know if everyone uses that information that way, but that's the recommendation I would have for the best way to use that.
If I could add, so on top of describing that range, I think we have to be very mindful that if there is a particular range indicated by predictive cut score, we have to be mindful of whether they're above the average in terms of the criterion score range or below average. And we also have to factor in those stringency premium and leniency discounts that we talk about, and to factor into those range of possible values for the identified cut scores.
Deanna, Laura, anything to add? Jen?
I think all this discussion points to having multiple sources, you know, judgment-based and predictive, and just getting the most information you can cut in different ways, right? Expressing all the limitations and maybe having the weights of some studies over others. I think it's a really hard thing to do, but I feel like somewhere in the middle is where I would want to be.
There's a question about the ASVAB and career readiness, and I just wanted to take a quick shot at I won't
And you, Wayne,
repeat,
couldn't resist that question. That's
won't
right in your sweet spot, Wayne.
And it's a good question because there is the ASVAB, and one could certainly use the ASVAB to establish, as the military does, proficiency to perform certain jobs in the military. There's a crosswalk to civilian jobs. So one could do that. The reason I think it's imprecise is because NAEP has commissioned some studies that tried to do that. And what we really found is that a lot of, let's pick on math, it's the easiest example. Many careers don't require math, but if they do, they require different math skills. So a test like an SAT or an ACT are really a poor predictor of the kind of math you need on a job. It may have geometry in some jobs and statistics in other jobs, and so it's all over the place. And even when we do job analysis, we couldn't come up with any convergence among panelists about what kind of math or how much math is required. So in theory, it's useful, and I think you can do it for specific jobs, but at a global definition, I think, I guess I've written about this. I can justify setting a college readiness benchmark knowing that it generalizes to the average colleges, but career readiness, because of the differences between job profiles and jobs within organization, there's a lot more variance. And so I think you can do it for the job of, clerk at, at a department store or for a programmer at Microsoft, but I don't think you can do it universally in the way that we use college readiness. So I think it's a harder methodology to apply.
You mentioned NAGB, and I only have one more month on the National Assessment Governing Board, and so I was gonna pitch a NAEP question to Laura. I see Susan and Sharon and a whole bunch of other NAEP folks on the line too, but I think we're gonna have to save that for the happy hour. We're at 5:26, and we have to do our post-test, our post-debate poll. So again, if you could go to this link, I've changed the question, and it's simply about whether this discussion pushed you one way or the other. It's great to see Will in the chat. I think we're going to have to save gain scores for another debate. Yes, that was the other thing I was going to point out, Wayne, regression to the mean. All right, we'll see if we can get a few more responses. Again, I'll put the forms right in here. We've got about 50, so we need to do, you actually can't do a different score because I didn't do individual identifiers, but we can take the average, and I will share my screen and show you the results. Let's see. Drum roll, please. My support has not changed is the winner, and it looks like 23% support it more, 25% support it less. Wow, this is really close. Are you sure that more people haven't voted? It looks like we have a slight edge for people who got pushed to supporting it less. And a few people who support it much, well, one person who supports it much more. That was probably Wayne. No, I'm just teasing. This is great. This is really close. I think if we had more complete data, we'd be able to draw stronger inferences about about who won this debate. I mean, what are we going to have to do? We're going to have to call a statistical tie. So I hate that terminology, by the way. This was fantastic. Thank you all for participating. Do not leave unless you absolutely have to. I'm not going to force you to stay. But what we've decided to do is take a couple of minutes break so that we can turn off the recording. We can let people who have to leave, and we can let people who aren't going to leave, go grab a drink of their choice. I can include like orange juice and milk for EC, for whom it's 5:30 in the morning in Singapore. And then we'll reconvene in a few minutes. Depending on how many people are still hanging around at that time, we can, I've got a little bit of a protocol you'll see when we come back. And it'll be fun. Maybe we'll play some games, or we'll just hang out and chat. Or maybe we'll resolve this debate once and for all after we can raise a glass to each other from many miles away. So thank you all for attending this debate. My thanks to my colleagues. It was invigorating and I learned a lot. And thanks again to NCME and this wonderful community that still keeps going at a distance. So we'll close it off here officially. Turn off the recording. Thank you, Aaron. And we'll take a 3-minute break and come back at 5:33 Eastern.